8 years ago, the military created the perfect soldier. Tonight, I'm about to discover that their failed experiment never died. It just got smarter, stronger, and hungrier. My name is Daniel Crane, and I'm walking back into the abandoned laboratory where we turned a decorated marine into something that should never exist. The cattle found torn apart near town weren't killed by wolves. The scratch marks on these steel walls are too large for any natural predator. And that yellow glow I just saw in the darkness above me, those are eyes that remember my face, and they're getting closer. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me where you watch this narrative from. The fine rain trickled down the broken windows of the abandoned laboratory when Daniel Crane returned to the place he had sworn never to set foot in again. The metallic smell of rust mixed with something else, something animal, wet and warm, was the same he remembered from the nights when screams echoed from the basement. It had been 8 years since the last time he was here. 8 years since the army shut down Project Werewolf, sealed files, erased identities, and spread the official story that the experiment had failed. But Daniel knew it wasn't true. He knew because he was there when Subject Zero they created escaped for the first time. Now, following the fresh marks found near the neighboring town, cattle carcasses torn open as if blades had ripped from the inside, trees snapped in half, and that trail of wild scent he would recognize anywhere, Daniel was certain the prototype had not only survived, but had come home. He walked slowly down the main corridor. The floor was covered with moss, and old electrical cables hung like dead roots. Each step seemed to awaken memories he had tried to bury. He remembered when he was still a lieutenant and believed that participating in Project Werewolf was a service to his country. The promise was to create soldiers capable of surviving any environment, strong as machines, fast as predators, but conscious as men. Except none of that was human enough to be controlled. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows on the peeling walls. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above, each drop echoing through the hollow space like a countdown. Daniel's breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he moved deeper into the facility. His footsteps crunched on broken glass and debris, but underneath those sounds he could swear he heard something else, a rhythmic scratching, like claws against metal, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead. The smell grew stronger with each step. It wasn't just the mustiness of abandonment or the metallic tang of rust. There was something organic about it, something that made his primitive brain scream warnings. It was the scent of a predator's den, of territory marked and claimed. Daniel's hand instinctively moved to the pistol at his hip, though he knew from experience that conventional weapons had proven useless against what they had created here. As he passed the old security checkpoint, Daniel noticed fresh scratches on the reinforced steel door. The marks were deep, deliberate, and far too large to have been made by any normal animal. They formed a pattern that was almost purposeful, like a signature, like someone or something announcing its return. The temperature seemed to drop as he ventured further into the facility. His breath came out in visible puffs now, and he could feel the cold seeping through his jacket. But it wasn't just the physical cold that made him shiver. It was the growing certainty that he wasn't alone in this place. Something was watching him from the shadows, something that remembered him just as clearly as he remembered it. The emergency lighting cast eerie red glows in sporadic patches, creating pools of bloody illumination separated by stretches of impenetrable darkness. Daniel pulled out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, but somehow making the shadows seem even deeper and more threatening. As the light swept across the walls, he caught glimpses of more scratch marks, some old and weathered, others that looked disturbingly fresh. A sound echoed from somewhere deep. In the facility, a low rumbling noise that seemed to come from the very foundations of the building. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a moan, but something in between that made Daniel's skin crawl. It was a sound he had heard in his nightmares for 8 years, a sound that had no business coming from anything that walked on God's earth. The memories came flooding back as Daniel stood in the ruined corridor, each one more painful than the last. He closed his eyes and could almost see the facility as it once was. Pristine white walls, bustling with scientists and military personnel, all working toward what they believed would be the future of warfare. Project Werewolf had been classified at the highest levels, known only to a select few who had signed agreements that would see them disappeared if they ever spoke of what they witnessed here. The project's genesis lay in the darkest corners of military ambition. After decades of watching soldiers return home, broken by conflicts that demanded more than human flesh and spirit could give, the Pentagon had authorized research into genetic enhancement. Not the crude steroids and stimulants of previous attempts, but something far more radical. They wanted to unlock the primal strength that lay dormant in human DNA, to awaken the predator that evolution had buried beneath civilization's veneer. Daniel remembered Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, the project's commanding officer, standing before a room full of scientists and military advisors, outlining their goals with clinical precision. "Gentlemen," Morrison had said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "we're not trying to make better soldiers. We're trying to make perfect killers, creatures that can survive in any environment, adapt to any threat, and eliminate any enemy." The early experiments had been conducted on volunteers, special forces operators, who had been told they were participating in advanced physical conditioning trials. They had no idea that the injections they received contained genetic material harvested from apex predators, carefully modified and designed to integrate with human DNA. The transformation process was supposed to be gradual, controllable, reversible. It was none of those things. Daniel had been assigned as a liaison between the military and civilian oversight committees, which meant he had access to all the test results, all the video footage, all the horrific documentation of what those early subjects endured. The first signs were always the same: increased appetite, particularly for raw meat, enhanced night vision, and sudden bursts of inexplicable rage. Then came the physical changes: elongated canine teeth, increased muscle mass, fingernails that grew into claw-like appendages no matter how often they were trimmed. The scientists had been thrilled with these developments. Remarkable adaptation, they called it in their reports. Evolutionary advancement in real time. But Daniel had seen the fear in the subjects' eyes as they lost more of their humanity with each passing day. He had watched strong, disciplined soldiers reduced to whimpering, confused creatures who no longer recognized their own reflections. Subject 1 had been different from the beginning. While the others had shown signs of mental deterioration, he had remained lucid, intelligent, even articulate, right up until the day he stopped speaking altogether. The scientists had named him Harrow, after his tendency to rake his claws across anything within reach, leaving deep furrows in metal, concrete, even reinforced glass. But intelligence without humanity was perhaps the most terrifying combination of all. Harrow had learned to hide his growing strength, to mask his increasing sensitivity to light and sound, to pretend that the transformation wasn't accelerating far beyond their ability to control it. He had played the perfect patient right up until the night he decided he'd had enough. The facility's air circulation system carried a new scent now, one that made Daniel's nostrils flare involuntarily. It was stronger than the rust and decay, more immediate than the lingering chemical residue. It was the smell of something wild, something that had marked this territory as its own, something that was very much alive and very close by. Daniel paused at the entrance to the main observation chamber, his flashlight beam playing across the reinforced glass that had once separated the research staff from their subjects. The barrier was spiderwebbed with cracks, some radiating outward from impact points that suggested tremendous force applied from within. Dark stains that could have been blood, or something worse, painted abstract patterns across the transparent aluminum composite. Behind the shattered viewing window lay the circular chamber where the bio-cryogenic cells had been housed. The room was empty now, stripped of equipment by the military cleanup crews who had sanitized the facility after its official closure. But the walls themselves told a different story. Deep gouges scarred the reinforced steel, each mark as wide as a human hand, but bearing the telltale signature of claws far too long to belong to any known predator. Daniel approached the damaged barrier slowly, his boots crunching on glass fragments that littered the floor like deadly snow. The scratches weren't random. They formed patterns, almost like a primitive written language. Some were clustered at human height, while others stretched impossibly high up the walls, suggesting whatever had made them possessed both human-like intelligence and inhuman physical capabilities. He pressed his palm against the cold metal of the doorframe, and immediately the past rushed back to claim him. The night of the breakout had started like any other. Daniel had been in his office, reviewing psychological evaluation reports when the first alarm began to sound. At first, he'd thought it was just another drill. The facility ran emergency protocols twice a week to ensure rapid response times. Then the screaming had started. Not the controlled shouts of soldiers following evacuation procedures, but raw, primal sounds of terror that spoke to something deep in the human brainstem. Daniel had rushed toward the main laboratory, following the sound of running footsteps and increasingly frantic radio chatter. The security cameras showed chaos in the lower levels, research staff fleeing in panic, guards fumbling with weapons they'd never expected to use, emergency lights bathing everything in hellish red illumination. The biocryogenic chamber had been breached from the inside. Not picked, not hacked, not even forced with tools, simply torn open with bare hands that had somehow generated enough pressure to buckle steel designed to withstand military-grade explosives. The subject containment cell stood empty, its occupant nowhere to be seen on any of the security feeds. But Daniel had known exactly where to look. Harrow had always been drawn to high places during his periods of agitation. The research staff had noted his tendency to climb, to seek elevated positions where he could observe his surroundings with tactical advantage. So when Daniel had reached the main chamber, he'd aimed his flashlight upward first, sweeping the ceiling-mounted support beams and ventilation systems. Yellow eyes had stared back at him from the shadows above. The creature that had once been a decorated Marine named Thomas Hartwell was barely recognizable. Months of genetic modification had elongated his frame, adding impossible muscle mass while somehow maintaining the fluid grace of a natural predator. His skin had taken on a grayish cast, and dark hair covered areas of his body where no hair had grown before. But it was his eyes that haunted Daniel's memory most, intelligent, aware, and completely devoid of human warmth. For a long moment, predator and observer had stared at each other across the ruined chamber. Daniel had felt the weight of those yellow eyes evaluating him, categorizing him, determining whether he represented threat or opportunity. The creature's head had tilted with almost curious precision, and Daniel had seen something that made his blood run cold. Recognition. Harrow remembered him, remembered the man who had sat in on his psychological evaluations, who had watched his transformation with barely concealed horror, who had been among the few to voice concerns about the project's direction. In that terrible moment of mutual recognition, Daniel had understood that he was looking at something that was neither fully human nor completely animal, something trapped between states of being and quite possibly insane from the transition. The creature had opened its mouth then, revealing canine teeth that belonged on a much larger predator, and made a sound that might have been an attempt at speech. The vocal cords, altered by the transformation process, could no longer form human words properly, but the intent was clear enough. It was trying to communicate, trying to reach across the gulf that separated what it had become from what it had been. Then, the tactical response team had arrived, and all pretense of communication had ended in violence. Now, standing in the ruins of that chamber 8 years later, Daniel could smell that same wild scent growing stronger. Somewhere in this abandoned facility, Harrow had returned to the place where his humanity had been stolen. And Daniel had the disturbing feeling that this time the creature wasn't interested in escape. This time it might be interested in revenge. The tactical team's arrival that night had changed everything. Daniel closed his eyes and could still hear the thunderous crash of combat boots on metal flooring, the sharp commands barked through radio headsets, the metallic click of weapons being primed for use. Lieutenant Morrison had taken personal command of the situation, his face a mask of cold determination as he directed his men into position around the main chamber. Subject 1 is to be contained and returned to holding, Morrison had ordered, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Use of force is authorized. But remember, this asset represents 8 months of research and development. We need it functional. Asset. The word had made Daniel's stomach turn. Not him, Not even the subject, but it, a piece of military equipment that had malfunctioned and needed repair. But Daniel had seen the intelligence in those yellow eyes, had witnessed the careful planning that had gone into Harrow's escape. Whatever the creature had become, it was still thinking, still planning, still fundamentally aware of its situation. The soldiers had moved with professional precision, establishing fields of fire and coordinating their approach through hand signals. They carried specialized weapons, high voltage, tasers designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage, nets reinforced with titanium wire, tranquilizer darts loaded with sedatives powerful enough to drop a grizzly bear. Everything calculated to subdue rather than destroy their multi-million-dollar investment. Harrow had watched them come with the patience of an apex predator. Daniel had seen that same stillness in nature documentaries, the moment when a big cat selects its prey and settles in to wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. The creature's breathing had slowed to almost imperceptible levels, its body coiled with potential energy, yellow eyes tracking the movement of each soldier as they took their assigned positions. The attack, when it came, had been devastating in its efficiency. Harrow had dropped from the ceiling beams with impossible silence, landing among the tactical team like a force of nature unleashed. The first soldier never knew what hit him. One moment he was advancing with his weapon raised, the next he was airborne, launched across the chamber by a backhand blow that should have been impossible for any creature of Harrow's size to deliver. The creature moved like liquid death, flowing between opponents with a grace that defied its massive frame. Claws that had grown beyond anything human raked across Kevlar body armor as if it were paper, leaving deep gouges in reinforced composite materials. The soldiers' weapons proved largely useless. Tasers failed to penetrate the creature's thick hide. Tranquilizer darts bounced off muscle that had hardened to near superhuman density. But it wasn't just the physical capabilities that made Harrow so terrifying. It was the way the creature fought with obvious intelligence, using tactics and strategy that spoke to military training that had survived the transformation. It separated the soldiers, used their own positioning against them, exploited weaknesses in their formation that only someone with combat experience would recognize. Daniel had pressed himself against the wall, watching in horrified fascination as 8 highly trained Special Forces operators were systematically dismantled by something that had once been one of their own. The sounds were the worst part. Not just the impacts of bodies hitting walls and the crash of equipment being destroyed, but the vocalizations that came from Harrow during the fight. Sounds that were part raw, part growl, and part something else entirely. Something that might have been words if vocal cords designed for human speech could still form them properly. In the middle of the chaos, Harrow had suddenly stopped and looked directly at Daniel. The yellow eyes had locked onto his with laser precision, and for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the creature had simply stared at him. Not with the blank, predatory gaze it had shown the soldiers, but with an expression that was unmistakably personal. The look had been complex, layered with meanings that Daniel's rational mind couldn't fully process. There was rage there, certainly, fury at what had been done to him, at the theft of his humanity, at the months of being treated like a laboratory specimen. But underneath the anger, Daniel had seen something else, something that looked almost like gratitude, as if the creature recognized Daniel as one of the few people who had tried to maintain his dignity during the transformation process. Or perhaps it was something darker. Perhaps Harrow was memorizing his face, filing it away for future reference, marking him as unfinished business in whatever remained of the creature's altered mind. The moment had been broken by Lieutenant Morrison's voice cutting through the chaos. "Forget containment, kill it now." Harrow's head had snapped toward the lieutenant with predatory focus, and Daniel had seen something shift in those yellow eyes. The intelligence was still there, but now it was coupled with pure, concentrated hatred. Morrison had just signed his own death warrant, though he wouldn't realize it until much later. The creature had turned away from Daniel then, focusing its attention on the remaining soldiers with renewed intensity. What followed was less a battle than a massacre, conducted with surgical precision by something that knew exactly how to kill human beings efficiently. When it was over, Harrow had simply walked to the nearest exterior wall, punched a hole through reinforced concrete as if It were drywall and disappeared into the night. Standing in the ruined chamber 8 years later, Daniel could still feel the weight of that yellow-eyed stare, and as the wild scent grew stronger in his nostrils, he began to suspect that Harrow had never forgotten him either. The official reports had classified Harrow's escape as a containment breach with catastrophic asset loss. The media had been told that an industrial accident at a classified research facility had resulted in several casualties, and the temporary evacuation of surrounding areas. Search teams had combed the wilderness for weeks, looking for any trace of the escaped subject, but they might as well have been hunting smoke. Daniel had known they would never find Harrow using conventional methods. The creature had retained all of its military training while gaining enhanced senses and physical capabilities that put it far beyond human pursuit. It could move silently through terrain that would challenge experienced trackers, could go without food for extended periods, and could detect approaching search teams from distances that made conventional tracking impossible. But that hadn't stopped them from trying. Daniel remembered the daily briefings, the expanding search grids, the increasingly desperate attempts to locate their missing asset. Satellite thermal imaging had been deployed, military tracking dogs had been brought in from specialized units, and even experimental acoustic detection equipment had been tested in the field. All of it had proven useless against a predator that seemed to understand exactly how modern search techniques operated. After 3 months of failure, the project had been officially terminated. The facility had been stripped of equipment, the remaining research staff had been reassigned to other programs, and the entire Werewolf initiative had been classified so deeply that most of the participants weren't even sure it had really happened. Daniel had been transferred to a desk job in Washington, where he'd spent the next 8 years trying to forget what he'd witnessed. But Harrow had never been far from his thoughts. Every time a news report mentioned unexplained animal attacks, every time hunters reported encounters with something that didn't match any known species, every time livestock was found dead under circumstances that defied natural explanation, Daniel found himself wondering if their lost asset had finally surfaced. The evidence had always been circumstantial, easily dismissed by authorities who preferred rational explanations to impossible ones. A few cattle found dead with wounds too precise for wild animals. Hikers reporting glimpses of something moving through the forest with unnatural speed. Hunters finding tracks that looked almost human, except for the claws. Nothing that couldn't be attributed to bears or mountain lions, or the overactive imaginations of people who spent too much time alone in the wilderness. Until 3 days ago, when Daniel had received a phone call from Sheriff Martinez in the small mountain town of Pine Ridge, 60 miles from the abandoned Werewolf facility. Martinez had been brief and professional, but Daniel had heard the uncertainty in his voice as he described the scene they'd discovered on the Hendricks Ranch. "We've got 17 head of cattle dead, Dr. Crane," Martinez had said, using the civilian title Daniel had adopted after leaving the military. But they weren't just killed, they were arranged, laid out in a pattern like someone was trying to send a message. And the wounds. Martinez had paused, clearly struggling with how to describe what he'd seen. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I've never seen anything tear through muscle and bone like that. Not even a grizzly could make cuts that clean." Daniel had known immediately what he was dealing with, but he'd needed to see the evidence for himself before he could be certain. The drive to Pine Ridge had taken him through familiar territory, winding mountain roads that led past the turnoff to the old Werewolf facility. He'd tried not to look as he passed the unmarked access road, but he'd felt the weight of the place like a physical presence, as if something in those ruins was calling to him. The cattle had indeed been arranged with deliberate precision, laid out in a rough circle with their heads pointing inward. The wounds were surgical, in their accuracy. Throats opened with single, precise strikes, organs removed with an understanding of anatomy that suggested intelligence rather than simple predatory instinct. But it was the tracks around the kill site that had confirmed Daniel's suspicions. Most of the prints looked like those of a large wolf or dog, showing the distinctive pad and claw marks of a predator adapted for running. But scattered among them were other impressions, longer, narrower marks that looked disturbingly like human footprints, except for the deep gouges at the toe points where claws had dug into the soft earth. Sheriff Martinez had noticed Daniel's particular interest in the tracks. "You ever seen anything like this before, Dr. Crane? I mean, in your research work?" Daniel had chosen his words carefully. His cover story identified him as a wildlife biologist specializing in predator behavior, which was close enough to the truth to be believable and vague enough to explain his interest in unusual cases. "There are accounts of wolves displaying unusually complex behavior," he'd said. "Pack dynamics can sometimes produce patterns that seem almost ritualistic." But even as he'd spoken, Daniel had known this wasn't the work of any natural predator. The intelligence behind the kill was too sophisticated, the methodology too precise. This was Harrow's work, and the circular arrangement of the cattle wasn't random. It was a symbol, a territorial marker, a message for anyone smart enough to understand what they were looking at. After 8 years of hiding in the wilderness, Harrow had decided to announce his presence, and he'd chosen to do it at a location that would inevitably draw Daniel back to the place where it all began. Now, standing in the abandoned facility with that wild scent growing stronger in his nostrils, Daniel realized he'd walked into a trap that had been 8 years in the making. Somewhere in the darkness around him, yellow eyes were watching, waiting, evaluating. The hunter had indeed returned. The question was whether Daniel was here as an old acquaintance or as prey. Daniel moved deeper into the facility, following the corridor that led to the residential section, where the civilian research staff had been quartered during extended testing phases. The beam of his flashlight revealed a level of destruction that went far beyond simple abandonment or even the official cleanup efforts. Doors had been torn from their hinges with such force that the metal frames were twisted and buckled. Furniture had been overturned and scattered, as if a tornado had passed through the confined space. But this wasn't the random destruction of natural disaster or even human violence. There was a pattern to the chaos, a methodical quality that suggested someone or something had been searching for specific items. Drawers had been pulled out and their contents scattered, but personal photographs and documents lay carefully arranged on surfaces, as if they'd been examined and then deliberately placed where they could be easily seen. The first room had belonged to Dr. Sarah Chen, the project's lead geneticist. Daniel remembered her as a brilliant woman who'd grown increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the research, as the transformation process had accelerated beyond their ability to control it. Her desk had been systematically dismantled, every drawer emptied, every file examined. But on the surface of the desk, arranged with careful precision, were a dozen family photographs showing Dr. Chen with her husband and 2 young daughters. The images hadn't been damaged. They'd been studied. Daniel could see the faint impressions of fingertips on the glass frames, but the prints were larger than normal human hands and showed the telltale marks of claws that had tried to be gentle but couldn't completely retract. Someone with superhuman strength had handled these photographs with painstaking care, as if trying to understand the concept of human connection through visual examination. Similar scenes played out in room after room. Personal effects had been examined and arranged, clothing had been sorted and categorized, even toiletries had been organized according to some alien logic. It was as if an intelligence that understood human objects, but not human emotions, had tried to decode the mystery of normal life through careful study of the artifacts left behind. The smell was stronger here, much stronger. It carried undertones that made Daniel's primitive brain recoil in instinctive fear, the scent of a predator's territory, of a lair that had been claimed and marked. But underneath the wild musk, he detected something else, the lingering trace of soap and shampoo, faint but unmistakable evidence that whatever had been living here had made some attempt to maintain human hygiene habits. Daniel paused at the doorway to the room that had housed Dr. Marcus Webb, the project's psychological evaluator. Webb had been the one responsible for monitoring the subject's mental state throughout the transformation process, documenting their cognitive changes and emotional responses as their humanity slowly eroded. His room showed signs of particular violence, walls scored with deep claw marks, furniture reduced to splinters, even the metal bed frame twisted into abstract sculpture. But here too, personal items had been carefully preserved and arranged. Webb's diplomas hung undamaged on the wall. His family photos were lined up with military precision on what remained of his desk, and his personal journal lay open to a page that made Daniel's blood run cold. The entry was dated just 2 days before Harrow's escape, and Webb's handwriting showed the increasing strain he'd been under as the project spiraled toward disaster. Subject 1 continues to demonstrate remarkable cognitive retention despite the extensive genetic modifications. Unlike the other subjects, who show clear signs of mental deterioration, Thomas seems to be maintaining full intellectual capacity while gaining enhanced physical capabilities. This should be encouraging, but I find it deeply disturbing. He watches us now, really watches us, with an intelligence that feels predatory rather than human. I'm beginning to suspect that we haven't enhanced his mind at all. We've simply removed the ethical constraints that normally limit human behavior. We've created something that thinks like a man but hunts like an animal. God help us all. The journal pages after that entry had been torn out with surgical precision, removed by claws that understood exactly what they were looking for. Someone had read Webb's assessment and decided that certain observations were too dangerous to leave behind. Daniel turned the page and found one final entry, this one written in a hand that shook with barely controlled terror. He spoke to me today, not the growling attempts at communication we've been documenting, but actual words, clear, precise, and utterly devoid of human warmth. He said, "Dr. Webb, you have been studying me for 6 months. Now I think it is time I studied you." Then he smiled, and I saw what we've really created here. We haven't made a better soldier. We've made a perfect hunter that can think like its prey. The rest of the page was blank, but Daniel noticed dark stains on the paper that looked disturbingly like dried blood. He closed the journal carefully, his hands trembling slightly as the implications sank in. Harrow hadn't just escaped. He'd been planning his freedom for months, studying his captors with the same scientific precision they'd applied to him. A sound from the corridor behind him made Daniel freeze, a soft scratching noise, like claws being drawn across metal with deliberate care. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful, and it was getting closer. He turned slowly, raising his flashlight toward the source of the noise, but the beam revealed only empty corridor stretching back toward the main facility. Yet the scratching continued, echoing off the walls with acoustic properties that made it impossible to determine the exact source. The wild scent was overwhelming now, so strong it made his eyes water, and underneath it, barely perceptible, but definitely present, was another odor that made his stomach clench with recognition, the smell of fresh blood. Daniel moved toward the source of the scratching sound with careful, measured steps. His training had never left him completely. Even after 8 years behind a desk, his body remembered the precise foot placement and controlled breathing that allowed soldiers to move silently through hostile territory. But he wasn't dealing with human opponents now, and every instinct he'd developed for warfare seemed inadequate against something that had been specifically designed to hunt his species. The corridor opened into the facility's old chemical laboratory. A sterile space that had once housed the sophisticated equipment needed to synthesize the genetic modification compounds. Most of the machinery had been removed during the official shutdown, but the mounting points and connection ports remained, giving the room a skeletal, violated appearance. Broken glass crunched under Daniel's boots as he entered, the sound impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. The scratching noise had stopped. Daniel swept his flashlight across the room methodically, checking corners and potential hiding places with the thoroughness of someone who understood that his life might depend on spotting danger before it spotted him. The beam revealed overturned lab benches, scattered chemical containers, and walls scored with the now familiar claw marks. But the room appeared empty. Then he made the mistake of looking up. The creature clung to the reinforced metal beams that supported the laboratory's ceiling with an ease that defied physics. Its massive frame should have been impossible to support in such a position, but genetically enhanced muscle density and redesigned bone structure had created something that could navigate three-dimensional space like a spider. Long arms, their proportions subtly wrong for human anatomy, gripped the metal supports with hands that ended in claws designed for both climbing and killing. The back was broad and powerful, covered with dark fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The muscle definition was extreme, each group clearly delineated under skin that had thickened to provide natural armor. But it was the size that made Daniel's breath catch. The creature was at least 8 feet long from head to the base of its spine, and that didn't account for limbs that had been stretched beyond human proportions. This was Harrow, but transformed far beyond what Daniel remembered from 8 years ago. The genetic modifications had continued to work even after the escape, pushing the creature's development in directions that the werewolf scientists had never anticipated. What they'd created wasn't an enhanced human. It was something entirely new, something that combined human intelligence with predatory capabilities that belonged to nightmares. The creature's head turned with fluid precision, and Daniel found himself staring into eyes that glowed with their own internal light. The yellow irises were larger than human normal, adapted for enhanced night vision, but they retained an unmistakably human intelligence. This was the gaze of something that could think, plan, and remember, something that recognized him. For a long moment, neither moved. Daniel felt like a small animal that had suddenly realized it was being studied by an apex predator. Every survival instinct screamed at him to run, but rational thought kept him frozen in place. Movement might trigger a chase response, and he was under no illusions about who would win in a race through the abandoned facility. The creature descended from its perch with impossible silence, flowing down the support beams like liquid shadow. Despite its massive size, it moved with the grace of something that had been born to hunt. Each movement was economical, precise, calculated to maintain perfect balance while positioning for optimal striking angles. This wasn't just enhanced human capability. This was evolutionary refinement pushed to its absolute limit. Daniel forced himself to breathe slowly, keeping his movements minimal and non-threatening. He'd read enough of the psychological profiles to know that Harrow retained his military training, which meant he understood tactics and threat assessment. Any sudden movement or aggressive gesture would be interpreted as hostile action and responded to accordingly. The creature reached the floor and straightened to its full height. Standing upright, it was even more imposing than Daniel had expected. The proportions were wrong in subtle ways that made his brain struggle to process what he was seeing. The torso was elongated, the arms longer than human standard, the legs built for both running and jumping with power that would put Olympic athletes to shame. But it was the head that truly drove home how far from human Harrow had traveled. The skull was larger, elongated to accommodate enhanced brain capacity and sensory organs. The jaw was more pronounced, built to support teeth that were clearly visible, even with the mouth closed. The ears were pointed and mobile, constantly adjusting to track sounds that Daniel couldn't even perceive. Dark fur covered most of the visible skin, growing in patterns that seemed to follow the muscle groups underneath. It wasn't random animal hair. It was precisely distributed for maximum insulation and protection while maintaining mobility. Even in this, the genetic modifications showed signs of intelligent design, as if the transformation had been guided by some internal logic that Daniel couldn't comprehend. The creature tilted its head, studying Daniel with obvious curiosity. There was no immediate aggression in its posture, no preparation for attack. Instead, it seemed to be evaluating him, trying to determine his intentions and assess his potential as either threat or opportunity. The intelligence behind those glowing eyes was clearly functional, and it remembered their last encounter. Daniel noticed fresh wounds across the creature's shoulders and back, deep cuts that were healing with unnatural speed, but still showed signs of recent trauma. Something had been hunting Harrow, something with weapons capable of penetrating his enhanced hide. The creature hadn't returned to the facility as a conqueror. He'd come back as a refugee, seeking sanctuary in the place where his transformation had begun. "Harrow," Daniel said softly, keeping his voice level and non-threatening. "Do you remember me?" The creature's ears swiveled forward, focusing on the sound with laser precision. Its head tilted again, and Daniel thought he saw a flicker of recognition in those alien eyes. The mouth opened slightly, revealing teeth that belonged on something much larger and much more dangerous than any terrestrial predator. For a moment, Daniel thought Harrow might try to speak. The vocal cords had been altered by the transformation, but perhaps enough human speech capability remained for simple communication. Instead, the creature made a sound that was part growl, part whine, and part something else entirely, something that might have been an attempt at Daniel's name, filtered through anatomy that was no longer entirely human. Then explosions began to thunder outside the facility. The first explosion rattled the entire facility, sending dust cascading from the ceiling and causing the remaining glass in the windows to spider with fresh cracks. Daniel felt the vibration through the floor, a deep percussion that spoke of military-grade ordnance being deployed with precision timing. Through the broken laboratory windows, he could see flashes of light illuminating the surrounding forest, vehicle headlights, searchlights, and the distinctive strobing of tactical flashlights wielded by professional soldiers. Harrow's reaction was immediate and visceral. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, ears flattening against his skull in a gesture that was purely animalistic, despite the human intelligence behind his eyes. His lips pulled back to reveal the full extent of his dental modifications: canine teeth that had been elongated and sharpened to weapons-grade points, molars that had been restructured for maximum crushing power, and an arrangement of cutting edges that could dismantle flesh and bone with surgical precision. But it was the sound that Harrow made that truly drove home how far from human he had traveled. It started as a low rumble deep in his chest, then built into something that was part roar, part howl, and part something else entirely. A vocalization that seemed designed to inspire primal terror in anything that heard it. The acoustic properties of the sound were wrong for human vocal cords, suggesting that the transformation had restructured his entire respiratory and phonetic system. Daniel found himself taking an involuntary step backward as the creature's attention shifted from curiosity to combat alertness. This was no longer the confused, injured refugee who had been seeking sanctuary in familiar territory. This was an apex predator, responding to the approach of potential threats, and every line of his enhanced physiology radiated lethal capability. The second explosion was closer, close enough to shake loose equipment that had been mounted on the laboratory walls. Through the broken windows, Daniel could see tactical vehicles moving through the forest with their lights extinguished, their positions revealed only by the faint sound of diesel engines and the occasional glimpse of infrared illuminators that his unenhanced human vision could barely detect. "They've found you," Daniel said, keeping his voice low but allowing a note of anger to creep in. 8 years, and they're still hunting you." Harrow's head swiveled back toward him, and Daniel saw something in those yellow eyes that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. It wasn't just the intelligence that he remembered from their previous encounter. It was recognition, and beneath that something that looked almost like relief. The creature remembered their last meeting, remembered that Daniel had been one of the few people in the facility who had tried to maintain his dignity during the transformation process. Dr. Chen had been the one to suggest that the subjects be referred to by name rather than number. Dr. Webb had insisted that they be provided with reading material and recreational activities during their confinement, but it had been Daniel who had argued for limiting the more invasive procedures, who had voiced concerns about the psychological impact of the transformation process, who had stood up in briefing after briefing to remind the research staff that they were dealing with human beings rather than experimental assets. Not that it had mattered in the end. The military priorities had always taken precedence over humanitarian concerns, and Daniel's objections had been noted and filed and ultimately ignored. But apparently, Harrow remembered those objections, remembered the few voices that had tried to speak for the subjects when they could no longer speak for themselves. The creature took a step closer, moving with that impossible silent grace despite his massive size. Daniel forced himself to remain still as Harrow leaned forward, bringing his enhanced senses to bear. The creature's nostrils flared as he scented the air around Daniel, processing information through olfactory capabilities that had been boosted far beyond human normal. Daniel held his breath as Harrow's investigation continued. This close, he could see the fine details of the transformation that had been invisible at a distance. The skin wasn't entirely covered with fur. Patches of exposed flesh showed a grayish cast that suggested improved circulation and enhanced healing capabilities. The muscle definition was extraordinary, each group clearly delineated and obviously functional rather than merely aesthetic. But it was the scars that told the real story. Harrow's body was covered with marks that spoke of 8 years spent surviving in conditions that would kill ordinary predators. Some were clearly from weapons, bullet wounds that had healed into puckered circles, blade cuts that had sealed but left permanent reminders of their passage. Others looked like territorial disputes with creatures that possessed claws and teeth of their own, evidence that Harrow hadn't been the only apex predator in whatever wilderness he had claimed as his territory. But the most disturbing scars were the ones that looked deliberately inflicted, carefully placed cuts that suggested surgical procedures rather than combat damage. Someone had been experimenting on Harrow during his years in exile, and the wounds showed signs of having healed and been reopened multiple times. The creature hadn't just been hiding in the wilderness, he'd been captured, studied, and presumably escaped again. That explained the fresh wounds Daniel had noticed earlier, and it explained why. Harrow had returned to the facility. He wasn't just seeking sanctuary, he was seeking answers, trying to understand what had been done to him and who was responsible for his continued suffering. A third explosion, much closer now, lit up the laboratory with strobing light. Through the windows, Daniel could see soldiers moving through the forest with professional precision, establishing perimeters and fields of fire with the methodical thoroughness of a well-trained hunting party. These weren't the panicked guards who had tried to contain Harrow 8 years ago. This was a specialized unit that had been preparing for this specific mission. Harrow snarled, a sound that made the hair on Daniel's arms stand up, despite the fact that the aggression wasn't directed at him. The creature's enhanced hearing had obviously picked up sounds that Daniel couldn't detect. Radio communications, equipment being positioned, the subtle acoustic signatures that preceded a coordinated assault. "They're not here to capture you this time," Daniel said, the realization hitting him with sickening clarity. "They're here to eliminate evidence, including him." Daniel's presence at the facility would be seen as a security breach that needed to be contained. The official story of Project Werewolf's failure couldn't be maintained if one of the original staff members started asking questions about escaped assets and continued operations. Harrow's attention shifted back to him, and Daniel saw something in those alien eyes that he hadn't expected. Concern. Not for himself, but for Daniel. The creature understood the tactical situation better than Daniel did, and his enhanced senses had probably already catalogued the weapons and personnel being deployed against them. He knew that neither of them was likely to survive the coming assault. The creature made that strange vocalization again, the one that might have been an attempt at speech. This time, Daniel thought, he heard actual syllables in the sound, words that had been filtered through vocal cords designed for purposes other than human communication. It might have been his imagination, but it sounded almost like "run." Instead, Daniel took a step closer to the creature who had once been Thomas Hartwell, and made a decision that would change both of their fates. "No," he said firmly, "we run together, or we don't run at all." The tactical assault began with textbook precision, exactly the kind of coordinated operation that Daniel had helped plan during his years in military intelligence. Flashbang grenades detonated simultaneously at multiple entry points, filling the facility with strobing light and disorienting noise, designed to overwhelm enhanced senses. Smoke canisters followed immediately, creating a dense fog that would mask the advance of soldiers equipped with thermal imaging and infrared targeting systems. But the attackers had made one crucial error in their planning. They were using tactics designed to confuse and disorient human opponents. Harrow's enhanced senses allowed him to navigate the chaos with supernatural precision, and 8 years of survival in hostile environments had taught him to function effectively under conditions that would incapacitate ordinary predators. The creature moved through the smoke like a force of nature, his enhanced hearing allowing him to track individual soldiers by their breathing patterns and heartbeats. Daniel heard the first screams begin almost immediately, raw sounds of terror and pain that spoke to encounters with something that shouldn't exist. The tactical teams had been briefed on their target's capabilities, but reading reports and experiencing the reality of facing Harrow in combat were entirely different experiences. "Follow me," Daniel called to Harrow, though he wasn't sure the creature could understand human speech clearly enough to follow complex instructions. To his surprise, Harrow appeared at his side instantly, moving with that impossible silent grace despite the chaos erupting around them. The creature's presence was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because Daniel knew that nothing human could match Harrow in single combat. Terrifying because he was placing his life in the hands of something that had been specifically engineered to kill his species. They moved through the facility's service corridors, areas that Daniel remembered from the evacuation drills that had been conducted during the original project. The soldiers would be focusing their search on the main areas, expecting their targets to follow predictable escape routes. But Daniel had helped design the facility's security protocols, and he knew about the maintenance tunnels that weren't marked on any of the official blueprints. Behind them, the sounds of combat continued to echo through the facility's corridors. Daniel heard automatic weapons fire, the sharp crack of specialized ammunition, and the occasional explosion that suggested the soldiers were using heavy ordnance to clear suspected hiding places. But he also heard other sounds, sounds that made his blood run cold. The tactical teams were dying, being picked off by something that moved faster than they could track and hit harder than their equipment could withstand. Harrow paused at a junction in the service tunnel, his enhanced senses obviously detecting something that Daniel couldn't perceive. The creature's head tilted, ears swiveling to track sounds that were below human hearing thresholds, and his nostrils flared as he processed scent information that told him more about their tactical situation than any electronic surveillance system. A low growl rumbled in Harrow's chest, and Daniel understood that they were no longer alone in the tunnels. The soldiers had anticipated the possibility of their targets using the service areas, and they'd positioned troops to intercept anyone who tried to escape through the facility's secondary routes. "How many?" Daniel whispered, though he wasn't sure Harrow could communicate numbers through their limited means of interaction. The creature held up his right hand, extending 3 fingers, 3 soldiers positioned somewhere ahead of them, probably with overlapping fields of fire, designed to catch anyone who emerged from the tunnel system. It was a professional setup, exactly the kind of tactical positioning that Daniel would have recommended if he'd been planning the operation. Harrow looked at Daniel and made a gesture that was unmistakably communicative, a raised hand that clearly meant, "Wait here." The creature intended to handle the soldiers himself, and he wanted Daniel to remain in a position where he wouldn't be caught in the crossfire. "No," Daniel said firmly. "We do this together." Harrow's head tilted, and Daniel thought he saw something like surprise in those yellow eyes. The creature hadn't expected human solidarity, particularly not from someone who understood exactly what he was capable of doing to armed opponents. The attack came with brutal efficiency. Daniel heard the first soldier die before he even realized the assault had begun. A choked-off scream that cut off abruptly as enhanced claws found vital organs with surgical precision. The second soldier managed to get off a few rounds before Harrow reached him, but the bullets might as well have been thrown stones for all the effect they had on reinforced muscle and bone. The third soldier was the smart one. Instead of trying to fight something that was obviously beyond human capability, he turned and ran, probably intending to radio for backup and establish a new defensive position. He might even have escaped if Daniel hadn't been there to cut off his retreat route. The collision was brief and decisive. Daniel had maintained his physical fitness during his years behind a desk, and 8 years of desk duty hadn't completely eroded the combat reflexes he'd developed during his military service. The soldier went down hard, his radio skittering across the tunnel floor and into the darkness beyond recovery. Harrow appeared beside them instantly, having covered the distance from the tunnel junction with inhuman speed. The creature looked down at the unconscious soldier, then at Daniel, and something like approval flickered in his alien gaze. Daniel had proven himself as an ally rather than a liability, and that changed the dynamic between them in subtle but important ways. They continued through the tunnel system, moving with increasing urgency as the sounds of combat from the main facility grew more intense. Daniel could hear helicopters circling overhead now, their rotor wash creating acoustic signatures that Harrow tracked with obvious unease. The creature's ears remained in constant motion, monitoring threats from multiple directions while maintaining the silent movement that kept them invisible to thermal imaging systems. The tunnel exit was exactly where Daniel remembered it, a concealed drainage outlet that emerged in the forest roughly 200 yards from the facility's main structures. The opening was hidden by overgrown vegetation and would be nearly impossible to spot unless someone knew exactly where to look. But as they approached the exit, Harrow suddenly stopped and pressed himself against the tunnel wall. His enhanced hearing had obviously detected something that Daniel couldn't perceive, and the creature's body language radiated tension that suggested immediate danger. A moment later, Daniel heard it too. The distinctive whine of drone rotors, multiple units conducting aerial surveillance of the forest around the facility. The soldiers weren't just hunting them inside the building. They'd established a perimeter that would detect anyone trying to escape through the surrounding wilderness. Harrow made that strange vocalization again, the sound that might have been an attempt at speech. This time Daniel was almost certain he heard actual words. Too many. Cannot run. The creature was right. They were trapped between the soldiers in the facility, and the surveillance net in the forest and conventional escape routes had been systematically eliminated. But Daniel had one more card to play, a contingency that he'd hoped never to use. During the original project, he'd maintained a personal emergency cache in the forest beyond the facility. Supplies, communications equipment, and transportation that could be used if the official evacuation procedures failed. It had been a violation of security protocols, but Daniel's growing unease with the project's direction had convinced him that unofficial backup plans might be necessary. The cache was still there. It had to be, and if they could reach it, they might have a chance to escape the closing net. But first they had to survive the next few minutes, as the hunt intensified around them. The emergency cache was located in a natural depression roughly half a mile from the facility, concealed beneath what appeared to be a fallen tree, but was actually a carefully constructed camouflage blind. Daniel had established it during the later stages of Project Werewolf, when his growing concerns about the research direction had convinced him that contingency planning might become necessary for survival rather than just career preservation. Getting there would require crossing open ground while avoiding aerial surveillance and ground patrols, a task that would challenge even experienced special forces operators. But Harrow possessed capabilities that put him far beyond human limitations, and he seemed to understand their tactical situation with the clarity of someone who had been hunted extensively during his years in exile. The creature led the way, through the forest with supernatural stealth, his enhanced senses allowing him to detect and avoid patrol routes that would have been invisible to human perception. Daniel followed as quietly as possible, trying to match Harrow's silent movement, while marveling at the creature's ability to navigate through dense undergrowth without disturbing so much as a single leaf. Above them, the drones continued their systematic search patterns, their thermal imaging systems, scanning the forest for heat signatures that might indicate human presence. But Harrow's body temperature had been altered by his genetic modifications, and his understanding of concealment techniques allowed him to mask their movement in ways that frustrated electronic detection. They paused at the edge of a small clearing where one of the search patrols was conducting a grid search, soldiers moving through the forest with professional precision while maintaining radio contact with their command center. Daniel counted at least 6 operators, all heavily armed and equipped with night vision systems that would make conventional hiding techniques useless. Harrow studied the patrol for several minutes, his enhanced hearing allowing him to monitor their radio communications and tactical coordination. Daniel watched the creature's face, noting the obvious intelligence behind his planning, as he evaluated various approach options and selected the optimal strategy for neutralizing the threat. The attack was swift and silent. Harrow moved through the patrol like a shadow, disabling soldiers before they could raise an alarm or respond with effective resistance. His enhanced speed and strength made the engagement almost comically one-sided, but Daniel noticed that the creature was being deliberately non-lethal in his methods. Soldiers were being knocked unconscious rather than killed, suggesting that Harrow retained enough humanity to distinguish between necessary violence and unnecessary killing. The last soldier managed to activate his radio before Harrow reached him, but his transmission was cut off mid-sentence as enhanced claws found pressure points that induced immediate unconsciousness. The incomplete message would alert the command center to potential problems in this sector, but it wouldn't provide specific intelligence about what they were facing or where their targets were heading. They reached the cache location as the first hints of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon. Daniel's camouflage blind had remained undisturbed during the 8 years since its construction, and the emergency supplies were exactly where he'd left them. Sealed containers holding water, food, medical supplies, communications equipment, and most importantly, transportation. The motorcycle was a modified trail bike with oversized fuel tanks and enhanced suspension systems designed for extended operation in rough terrain. It had been wrapped in protective materials and stored with preservation procedures that had kept it functional despite nearly a decade of abandonment. Daniel had maintained it obsessively during the project's active phase, driven by paranoid concerns that were beginning to seem entirely rational. Harrow examined the motorcycle with obvious curiosity, his enhanced intellect allowing him to understand its purpose, even though he'd probably never encountered such equipment during his years in the wilderness. The creature's head tilted as he studied the machine's construction, and Daniel thought he detected something like approval in the creature's examination. "It'll carry both of us," Daniel explained, though he wasn't entirely sure how they'd manage the logistics of transporting something of Harrow's size and mass. "But we need to move fast. Once they realize we're mobile, they'll expand the search perimeter and bring in additional resources." The creature made that vocalization that might have been an attempt at speech, and this time Daniel was almost certain he heard the word "where" buried in the alien sounds. Harrow was asking about their destination, displaying planning capacity that went far beyond simple survival instincts. Daniel had been thinking about that question since the moment he'd realized the facility was under assault. Their options were limited. They needed somewhere that offered concealment, resources, and most importantly, leverage that could be used against whoever was responsible for the continued hunting of werewolf assets. "There's someone who might be able to help us," Daniel said, pulling out a secure satellite phone from the emergency supplies. "Someone who knows what really happened to the project and who might be willing to tell the truth if they understand what's at stake." Dr. Sarah Chen had relocated to Seattle after Project Werewolf's official termination, establishing a private research practice that specialized in genetic medicine. She'd been one of the few scientists who had openly questioned the project's ethical direction, and Daniel suspected she'd maintained documentation that could expose the truth about what had really happened during those final weeks. The phone call connected on the second ring, and Dr. Chen's voice carried the professional alertness of someone accustomed to emergency consultations at unusual hours. "Dr. Chen, this is Daniel Crane. We need to talk." There was a long pause, and Daniel could almost hear the recognition and fear in the silence that followed. "Daniel," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral, "I thought you'd moved on from that line of work." "It's moved back into my life," Daniel replied, "and I think you know why. We need somewhere safe to meet, and we need it soon." Another pause, longer this time. Dr. Chen had been there during Harrow's transformation and escape. She'd seen what the creature was capable of, and she understood the implications of Daniel's call. "There's a cabin," she said finally. "Private property, about 60 miles north of the city. I'll text you the coordinates." "Sarah," Daniel said, watching as Harrow continued to examine their transportation options with obvious intelligence, "you should know. I'm not coming alone." The silence that followed lasted almost 30 seconds. "Jesus Christ, Daniel," Dr. Chen whispered. "Please tell me you're not bringing what I think you're bringing." "He's not what you remember," Daniel said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. 8 years have changed him. He's more than what we created. "God help us all," Dr. Chen said, and disconnected the call. Daniel looked at Harrow, who had been listening to the conversation with obvious comprehension. The creature's enhanced hearing had probably allowed him to monitor both sides of the call, and his intelligence was clearly sufficient to understand the implications of their planned meeting. "She's afraid of you," Daniel said. "They all are. But she might be the only one who can help us understand what's really happening." Harrow made that sound that might have been his name, and Daniel thought he detected something like sadness in the alien vocalization. The creature understood that he was feared, that his very existence was seen as a threat rather than a tragedy. But he also seemed to understand that Dr. Chen might represent their best chance for finding answers. They mounted the motorcycle as the sounds of helicopter searches began to intensify in the distance. Daniel took the controls, while Harrow positioned himself behind the seat, his enhanced strength allowing him to maintain his grip without interfering with the machine's operation. As they headed into the forest, Daniel found himself wondering if they were racing towards salvation, or simply delivering Dr. Chen to the same forces that had been hunting them. But with dawn breaking and their enemies closing in, any option was better than waiting for the inevitable confrontation that would end with both of them dead. Behind them, the abandoned werewolf facility burned as incendiary charges destroyed the last physical evidence of humanity's attempt to create the perfect predator. But the evidence was riding behind Daniel now, alive and intelligent and remembering everything that had been done to him. And somewhere ahead of them, in a cabin 60 miles north of Seattle, Dr. Sarah Chen was preparing to face the consequences of what they had all helped to create. The motorcycle's engine noise would have made them easily trackable under normal circumstances, but Harrow's enhanced hearing allowed him to detect aircraft and search teams long before they came within sensor range. The creature's supernatural awareness turned their escape into a deadly game of three-dimensional chess, with patrol routes and search patterns that shifted in response to intelligence reports and tactical updates. They rode through terrain that would challenge experienced off-road riders, but Harrow's enhanced strength and reflexes compensated for the motorcycle's stability issues, while his preternatural balance kept them upright through turns that should have sent them tumbling into ravines. Daniel found himself trusting the creature's judgment completely, following navigational suggestions that took them through paths that existed more in Harrow's enhanced perception than in any mapping system. The wound in Harrow's shoulder had reopened during their escape from the facility, and Daniel could see dark stains spreading across the creature's improvised clothing. The genetic modifications had given him enhanced healing capabilities, but 8 years of constant stress and inadequate nutrition had taken their toll. Whatever had been hunting Harrow during his exile had inflicted damage that went beyond simple physical trauma. They stopped twice during the journey to allow the creature to rest and for Daniel to attempt basic field treatment of the most serious injuries. Harrow submitted to medical attention with surprising docility, perhaps remembering Daniel's efforts to limit the more invasive procedures during the original project. But it was clear that conventional medicine was inadequate for treating someone whose physiology had been so extensively modified. "We need to get you proper medical attention," Daniel said, as he applied pressure dressings to wounds that were healing at visibly accelerated rates. "Sarah will know how to treat your specific conditions." Harrow made that vocalization that might have been agreement, though his yellow eyes remained fixed on the forest around them, with constant vigilance. Even while accepting treatment, the creature maintained awareness of potential threats from multiple directions, his enhanced senses monitoring their environment with precision that put electronic surveillance systems to shame. The cabin that Dr. Chen had specified was exactly the kind of location Daniel would have chosen for a clandestine meeting. Isolated, defensible, and far enough from population centers to avoid civilian casualties if things went badly. But as they approached the coordinates, Harrow's body language began to radiate increasing tension, suggesting that his enhanced senses were detecting something that concerned him. Dr. Chen was waiting for them on the cabin's front porch, exactly as Daniel had expected. What he hadn't expected was the obvious fear in her posture as she watched Harrow dismount from the motorcycle. She'd seen the creature during his transformation, but 8 years of freedom had changed him in ways that made her previous experience seem inadequate preparation. "My God," she whispered, as Harrow straightened to his full height. "He's enormous." The creature had indeed grown since his escape, adding muscle mass and skeletal density that put him far beyond the parameters the werewolf scientists had originally projected. But it was the intelligence in his movement that really drove home how much he had changed. This wasn't the confused, angry subject who had broken free from the laboratory. This was something that had learned, adapted, and evolved during 8 years of independent existence. Dr. Chen maintained her professional composure despite obvious nervousness, approaching Harrow with the careful movements of someone who understood that sudden gestures might be interpreted as threats. "Thomas," she said, using his original human name, "do you remember me?" Harrow's head tilted, and he made a sound that was unmistakably communicative, a low rumble that might have been recognition. His enhanced vision allowed him to study Dr. Chen's face with precision that probably revealed details about her emotional state that she couldn't conceal. "He remembers," Daniel said. "He remembers all of us." Inside the cabin, Dr. Chen had prepared medical equipment and data files that suggested she'd been anticipating this meeting for years. Her portable diagnostic systems were far more sophisticated than anything Daniel had seen outside of major medical facilities, and she worked with the efficiency of someone who had extensive experience treating unusual physiological conditions. The genetic modifications continued to express themselves after his escape, she explained, as she conducted preliminary examinations of Harrow's injuries. What we initiated in the laboratory was just the first phase of a transformation process that we never fully understood. Harrow submitted to the examination with surprising patience, though Daniel noticed that the creature's attention remained focused on potential escape routes and threat vectors. Even while accepting medical treatment, he was prepared for immediate violence if the situation required it. "The wounds are interesting," Dr. Chen continued, her professional fascination overriding her obvious fear. "They're healing at accelerated rates, but there are signs of repeated trauma to the same locations. Someone has been studying him, taking tissue, samples, and conducting experiments." The implication was clear. Harrow hadn't just been hiding in the wilderness during his 8 years of freedom. He'd been captured, examined, and presumably subjected to procedures that made the original Werewolf project look humane by comparison. Someone had been continuing the research, using him as an unwilling test subject for experiments that pushed his enhanced physiology to its absolute limits. "Who?" Daniel demanded. "Who's been doing this to him?" Dr. Chen hesitated, clearly struggling with security considerations that went far beyond simple professional discretion. "The project never really ended," she said finally. "It was transferred to private contractors, black-budget operations that operate outside normal oversight. They've been using Thomas to develop enhanced interrogation techniques and biological weapons systems." Harrow's reaction to this revelation was immediate and visceral. The creature's lips pulled back to reveal his enhanced dental modifications, and he made a sound that was pure predatory rage. But the anger wasn't directed at Dr. Chen. It was focused on the knowledge that his suffering had been deliberately prolonged for scientific purposes. "He's not just a victim," Dr. Chen continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "He's become something entirely new. The genetic modifications have stabilized into patterns that we never anticipated. He's not human anymore, but he's not animal either. He's something else, something that might represent the next stage of human evolution." Daniel looked at Harrow, seeing the creature with new understanding. The intelligence, the enhanced capabilities, the adaptation to conditions that would kill ordinary predators. It wasn't just genetic modification run amok. It was evolution in action, guided by 8 years of survival pressure that had shaped the transformation in directions that no laboratory could predict. "What does that make him?" Daniel asked. Dr. Chen met his gaze with eyes that held both wonder and terror. "It makes him the future," she said, "and it makes everyone else obsolete." Outside the cabin, the sound of helicopter rotors began to grow louder, approaching from multiple directions with the precision of a coordinated search operation. Harrow's enhanced hearing had obviously detected the approaching aircraft long before they came within range of human perception. The creature stood, moving with that fluid grace that still amazed Daniel, despite everything he'd witnessed. Harrow approached the cabin's window and looked out at the forest, with senses that could probably detect individual soldiers from distances that would require binoculars for human observation. "How many?" Daniel asked. Harrow held up both hands, all fingers extended. 10 aircraft, which probably meant 50 to 60 soldiers equipped with specialized weapons and orders to eliminate all witnesses. The private contractors weren't taking any chances this time. Dr. Chen was already packing her equipment with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for this contingency. "There's another way out," she said, "but it means going deeper into the forest, into territory that—" She hesitated, looking at Harrow with something like apology. "Into territory where he won't be the only predator." Harrow made that sound that might have been amusement, a rumbling vocalization that suggested he understood exactly what Dr. Chen was implying. 8 years of survival had taught him to coexist with other apex predators, and he apparently wasn't intimidated by the prospect of encountering additional challenges. As the helicopters drew closer, Daniel realized they were about to discover whether Harrow's evolution had prepared him for the ultimate test of his enhanced capabilities. The creature who had once been Thomas Hartwell was about to face the forces that had created him, and the outcome would determine whether humanity's attempt to create the perfect predator had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams or their darkest nightmares. The pursuing forces had learned from their previous encounters with Harrow. Instead of the conventional military tactics that had failed so catastrophically at the facility, they deployed specialized equipment designed specifically for hunting enhanced targets: thermal imaging systems calibrated for modified physiology, acoustic sensors tuned to detect enhanced cardiovascular signatures, and weapons loaded with ammunition that could penetrate genetically reinforced tissue. But 8 years of survival had taught Harrow lessons that no laboratory simulation could replicate. He moved through the forest like a force of nature, his enhanced senses allowing him to detect and avoid detection grids that would confound ordinary predators. Daniel and Dr. Chen followed in his wake, trusting their lives to a creature whose capabilities had evolved far beyond anything they could have imagined during the original project. The forest changed as they moved deeper into the wilderness, transitioning from managed woodlands to primal ecosystem that felt untouched by human influence. Daniel noticed that Harrow's behavior changed as well. The creature moved with increasing confidence, as if he was entering familiar territory where his enhanced abilities provided maximum advantage. "This is where he's been living," Dr. Chen observed, noting the subtle signs of long-term habitation that were invisible to untrained eyes. "He's established a territory here, learned to coexist with the natural ecosystem." Scratch marks on trees at impossible heights, trails that showed the distinctive pattern of Harrow's modified gait, and scent markers that spoke to territorial behavior that combined human intelligence with predatory instincts. The creature hadn't just survived in the wilderness, he'd adapted to it, becoming something that was neither fully human nor entirely animal. The pursuit continued for hours, with helicopter searches and ground teams that pushed deeper into the forest than Daniel would have thought possible. But the farther they traveled from civilization, the more apparent it became that Harrow held advantages that his hunters couldn't overcome. This was his territory, mapped and memorized through years of careful exploration, and he used every geographic feature to their tactical advantage. They paused at a natural spring where Harrow had obviously established a regular resting point. The creature's wounds were healing with visible progress, and his enhanced physiology was adapting to the stress of prolonged flight with capabilities that seemed almost supernatural. Dr. Chen monitored his recovery with instruments that confirmed what Daniel's eyes could see. Whatever had been done to Thomas Hartwell, it had created something that was rapidly moving beyond human parameters entirely. "The modifications are still active," she explained, reviewing her readings with obvious amazement. "His cellular regeneration is accelerating under stress conditions, and his neurological adaptations are showing patterns that suggest continued development." "Development toward what?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Dr. Chen met his gaze with eyes that held equal measures of wonder and fear. "Towards something that doesn't need us anymore." The sound of their pursuers had faded during the day, but Daniel knew that their absence was temporary. The private contractors wouldn't give up after investing 8 years and considerable resources in hunting their escaped asset. They would regroup, bring in additional equipment, and expand their search parameters until they found what they were looking for. But as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Harrow's behavior suggested that he wasn't concerned about immediate pursuit. The creature's enhanced senses would have detected approaching threats from miles away, and his relaxed posture indicated that their current location was secure from conventional search methods. "There's something else," Dr. Chen said, studying her diagnostic readings with growing excitement. "The genetic modifications aren't random anymore. They're following specific patterns, as if his enhanced physiology is directing its own evolution." She showed Daniel the data, cellular activity patterns that suggested Harrow's body was actively selecting and implementing beneficial adaptations while discarding genetic sequences that provided no survival advantage. It wasn't just genetic engineering run amok. It was guided evolution operating on timescales that would normally require geological epochs. He's becoming something new, Daniel realized, understanding the implications of what he was seeing. Not just enhanced human, but an entirely new species. Harrow had been listening to their conversation with obvious comprehension, and he made that vocalization that might have been agreement. The creature understood what he was becoming, and he seemed to have accepted his transformation with equanimity that spoke to a level of self-awareness that was profoundly unsettling. As darkness fell, their pursuers resumed their search with enhanced night vision equipment and thermal imaging systems that painted the forest in false color displays. But Harrow's thermal signature had changed during his years of adaptation, and his understanding of concealment techniques allowed them to remain invisible to electronic detection while maintaining visual contact with their hunters. Daniel watched through night vision binoculars as search teams moved through the forest below them, soldiers who had been specifically trained for hunting enhanced targets, but who were operating in an environment where their quarry held every possible advantage. It was a futile exercise, but Daniel knew they would continue until their resources were exhausted or their political support evaporated. "They'll never stop," he said to Harrow, though he wasn't sure how much human language the creature still understood. "As long as you exist, they'll keep hunting you." Harrow made a sound that was unmistakably communicative, and this time Daniel was certain he heard actual words buried in the alien vocalization. Let them come. The creature wasn't afraid of his pursuers anymore. 8 years of survival had taught him that he was faster, stronger, and smarter than anything they could send against him. But more than that, his continued evolution was carrying him beyond the reach of conventional threats. He was becoming something that couldn't be contained by human technology or defeated by human tactics. Dr. Chen had finished her analysis, and her expression carried implications that made Daniel's chest tighten with apprehension. "The transformation is accelerating," she said. "The stress of pursuit is triggering adaptive responses that are pushing his development beyond anything we modeled in the laboratory." She showed him genetic readings that tracked cellular changes occurring in real time, modifications that were rewriting Harrow's DNA with precision that suggested active intelligence guiding the process. His body wasn't just healing from wounds, it was improving itself, eliminating weaknesses and enhancing capabilities with each successive trauma. "How long?" Daniel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "At current rates of change, 6 months, Dr. Chen replied. "Maybe less. After that, he won't be recognizably human in any biological sense." Daniel looked at Harrow, seeing the creature with new understanding. The intelligence was still there, the recognition and even affection that spoke to retained humanity. But underneath the familiar elements, something entirely new was emerging, something that might represent the next stage of terrestrial evolution. As dawn broke over the forest, their pursuers finally abandoned their search and withdrew to regroup for another attempt. But Daniel knew that future hunts would be even more futile than this one. Harrow was evolving beyond their ability to track, beyond their capacity to understand, beyond their power to contain. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, his enhanced physiology clearly visible in the morning light, muscle definition that belonged on something much larger, sensory organs that had been redesigned for enhanced perception, and proportions that suggested adaptation for environments that didn't exist on Earth. Yet. Harrow looked back at Daniel and Dr. Chen one final time, his yellow eyes holding intelligence that was unmistakably personal despite everything that had changed about his physical form. There was gratitude there, and something that might have been affection, but underneath those familiar emotions was something else, something that suggested he understood that this would be their final meeting. The creature who had once been Thomas Hartwell was about to complete his transformation into something that human language had no words to describe. And when that change was finished, he would no longer need the protection or companionship of the species that had created him. He would be something entirely new, perfectly adapted for survival in a world that was rapidly changing in ways that humanity couldn't yet comprehend. And perhaps, someday, when the planet's ecology required predators with capabilities beyond anything that evolution could produce naturally, his descendants would inherit the Earth. But for now, he was still Harrow, enhanced, evolved, but still fundamentally recognizable to the people who had watched his transformation begin in a sterile laboratory 8 years ago. The creature raised his hand in a gesture that was unmistakably human, despite the claws that had replaced his fingernails. Then he turned and disappeared into the forest with that supernatural silence, carrying with him the future of terrestrial predation. Daniel and Dr. Chen stood alone in the clearing, watching the forest where something beyond human imagination was beginning the final phase of its evolution. Behind them lay the world of laboratories and military projects and scientific hubris. Ahead lay a wilderness, where nature was being rewritten by intelligence that had transcended the boundaries between human creativity and biological possibility. Harrow was free, and in that freedom he was becoming something that would make humanity's greatest achievements seem like primitive first attempts at conscious evolution. The future belonged to creatures like him, enhanced, adapted, and utterly beyond the control of the species that had given them birth. And in the deep forest, where human footsteps rarely fell, that future was taking its first steps toward a world where the phrase survival of the fittest would acquire meanings that even Charles Darwin could never have imagined. Thank you for experiencing this terrifying journey into the heart of genetic horror and evolutionary transformation. If this story sent chills down your spine and kept you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of creatures that blur the line between human and beast. Leave a like if Harrow's transformation fascinated and terrified you, and drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. We'd love to know how far our stories of genetic nightmares are reaching. Have you heard stories of strange creatures in your region? Unexplained animal attacks, mysterious howls in the night, or sightings of things that shouldn't exist? Share your own encounters in the comments. Your story might inspire our next terrifying tale. Share this video with anyone brave enough to discover what happens when science plays God with human DNA and creates something that was never meant to walk the earth. Until next time, remember, in the deepest forests, where human footsteps rarely fall, evolution never stops, and sometimes it creates things that hunt in the darkness with intelligence far beyond our understanding.